previous books include 99 to 1 and Wealth and Our Commonwealth with Bill Gates Sr. He's written articles that have appeared in The Nation, The American Prospect, and many other outlets, including inequality.org. Welcome, Chuck Collins, to New Jersey.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you for your hospitality, people from Montclair. I have some elders that were a member of this congregation. First time I've ever been here. Bill Brock and Nancy Brock. Some of you are from Montclair. I know I got to visit the garden there. So thank you for inviting me to Montclair. And congratulations on the work of the Faith into Action Network. Just 2 days ago, I was with our Massachusetts UU Action Group, which is our state cousin to you all. And I think Gary earlier was saying, we should do things together with other states like Massachusetts. And I'm like, yes, amen to that. Because, I think we as UU associations we're kind of hyper engaged. We punch above our weight, as Bill Schultz used to say. We have the capacity and the ability to kind of show up and help advance all the things that you're working on. So thank you for that. And I should just, I want to talk to you about the moment that we're in. I think I don't have to spend a lot of time talking about what's the situation, right? That's what brought you here. You're tuned into the painful, extreme inequalities that we're all living through. I think it's if you're halfway open-hearted, it is just painful to behold the extreme inequalities that are around us, and that is an invitation for us to be engaged. And I just want to, Rob mentioned that I'm actually the great-grandson of the meatpacker Oscar Mayer. So my dad used to say, bringing home the bacon had a different meaning in our family. And I did, win the lottery at birth, born on third base. I grew up actually where Rob went to nursery school in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, a suburb of Detroit. And I went to a boys' private school. I was kind of, the school motto was aim high, depicted by an archer shooting an arrow straight into the air. Should you think about it? Maybe anyway, so we were being groomed though to, take our proper place at the head of the boardroom table and the elites. And one of my, a couple of years older than me, classmate was Mitt Romney. Now, did he aim high or what? So anyway, but I partly, when we talk about these extreme inequalities, I'm trying to think, what is it that I might offer that you're not already steeped and aware of? And I want to offer a few thoughts and then hear thoughts and questions from you. But one thing I'll just mention for those of you, I did grow up in a UU congregation. And I had an amazing youth group leader. I was part of religious education, and we did what today we call neighboring faiths before it had a name. And for any of you who have, taught younger people, just know that it made a huge difference in my life to be around UU elders who held up and lived the values and kind of offered a different path than just one of, just allow the status quo to live on. So there is something powerful about all the witness work that you're doing with allies and immigrants. And there's also the ministering to the affluent, to the haves, to the helping show that there are other ways to live and ways to be connected to the wider work in the community. And I want to invite you, in the work I do at the Institute for Policy Studies, I'm not going to go and talk about it much, but I do co-edit a website called inequality.org, and I'll pass around a little clipboard if you're interested. And every week I send out on Mondays a roundup of both what's happening, what are the social movements, who are the faces on the front line, and what can we do together. So if you're interested and hungry for more, or if you're giving a presentation or talk, and you want data, facts, the latest chart, whatever, think of inequality.org as a resource. So, what's the picture that we're living through? And I'm not going to say much about it because I want to talk a little bit about the solutions that you all are involved in, what we're doing. But here, if I had like 1 minute on TV, this is what I would say. For 4 decades now, real wages for over half the people in this country have been flat or falling. So since the late 70s, half the population has not shared in the economic gains that most of the society has experienced. Almost all the gains since the economic meltdown a decade ago have gone not to the top 1%, both wealth growth and income growth, but to the top 1/10 of 1%. Those are folks with 20 million in wealth and up. So it's a small segment. That's where most of the gains are going. And the higher up the economic ladder we go, the more the share of the income and wealth pie is going. So the richest 400 billionaires in the United States today have combined as much wealth as the bottom 64% of households combined. The wealthiest 400 billionaires have as much wealth combined as the entire wealth of the entire African American population of the United States and a third of the Latino population combined. That, to me, is the story of our time. And it's different. It's a different kind of inequality than we saw in the 70s or after World War II. It's like what Reverend Greg said, it's like the robber baron era a century ago levels of inequality. But another piece of that is, how is it possible? How is that possible? Part of what's happening is the rising ranks of what I call underwater nation, meaning people who have zero or negative wealth to fall back on. That has grown to now 21% of the population. Zero or negative wealth. 37% of African American households. 33% of Latino households. That is, think about what that means. The vulnerability, the sense of lack of well-being, insecurity, and not having the platform to just take advantage of other opportunities in life when you're in that precarious situation. And if Thomas Piketty's commentary was, if the United States is on track, if we don't intervene in the machinery now that's creating these extreme inequalities, if we just stay on autopilot, we will become a hereditary aristocracy of wealth, where the sons and daughters of today's billionaires will dominate our politics, culture, philanthropy, and economy. And you may be thinking, well, aren't we already there? But actually, we will be more so. And I think we know that actually, one interesting thing about that is that actually no one wants to go in that direction. Even there are wealthy people that are speaking out and saying, we don't want to go down that road. We don't want to become an economic and racial apartheid society. And so therefore, we have to intervene. Because as each year passes, the ruts of inequality, the trauma that's created by disparities and inequities deepen, as well as the concentration of wealth and power at the top. And that is the moral moment that we're in. I probably, if I were talking to a general audience, I might go down the list of why this matters. Because there's now a mountain of research. And by the way, it's almost 15 years ago, I was meeting with the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. And one of the bishops said, I understand the gospel imperative to address poverty, but does it really matter how much wealth the wealthy have, the concentration of wealth? Because if we start, let's focus on poverty, he said. If we start to talk about wealth, then we're feeding into the politics of envy and resentment. And I said, I don't know what gospel you read, but, I think that this guy Jesus had something to say about great wealth as well as poverty. But who was I to question the bishop, right? But now, I wish I knew what I know now, because now there is a mountain of research in every discipline showing that the concentration of wealth matters enormously, that it actually undermines and distorts pretty much everything we care about. And so, I don't have to tell you this, I think you understand, but you may, as fellow campaigners, be out there talking to people where you're sort of essentially needing to say, why does this matter? Why does what's happening at the top end of the society matter? Clearly it affects our democracy. And we're in a kind of democratic crisis now, where the concentration of wealth and power is distorting all the functioning institutions, or is creating dysfunction within the institutions of our democratic system. Not just elections, but governing the political system, every aspect of citizen participation. It's undermining social mobility, right? The American dream, the idea that, it has moved to Canada. There was some social mobility in the 50s and 60s and 70s, particularly for white households. But today, we're stalled out, and there's a decline in social mobility. In fact, the physics of inequality today, if I were to describe it, is accelerating advantage at the top, compounding advantage at the top, and compounding disadvantage at the bottom. And that's what we're discovering and learning about why these inequalities matter. And it makes it harder for you to do the work that you're doing, whether you showed up here today because of your concern for the criminal justice system, to our neighbors who are welcoming the new immigrants to our country, dealing with drug policy, dealing with mass incarceration, dealing with protecting the earth and defending the earth. These extreme inequalities and imbalance of wealth and power are making our job in each of these areas harder. So we have to find ways to address it. As a UU, though, I could go down the list, and I do in the books that I've written about why these inequalities matter, why they affect healthy businesses. I've been made the case before business leaders, and you may be, as a campaigner, needing to make the argument and say, look, these extreme inequalities of income and wealth are actually bad for a healthy functioning economy. They're bad for economic stability. They create volatility. They create some people with enormous debt, low-wage workers without the economic capacity to participate in the economy. There's a whole economic reason that you may need to make. But in the end, what's fundamental is these extreme inequalities undermine our commitment to recognize the interconnectedness of all beings and to celebrate life and our fundamental UU values are threatened by these extreme inequalities. And that is ultimately what I think motivates most people to want to get in there and address these extreme inequalities. The interconnectedness of all beings is being pulled apart and distorted. So, what's the way forward? And I think a number of you have been involved in state minimum wage work and others. If I were going to say, what are the categories of activities? There are the things that we could do to raise the floor, to create a decency floor. The reason the Nordic countries and Canada have less extreme inequality is because they have a much higher floor of decency through which people cannot fall. So raising the minimum wage, universal health insurance, access to lifelong learning and education, all those things that create a floor of decency and a fundamental sense of security. Then there are the things that create kind of opportunity and a level playing field, arresting the influence of money in politics, making sure that we're making investments so that you don't have to be born rich to have opportunities and have a decent life in this country. And then there's another category, what I call addressing the concentration of wealth and power. And really, it's necessary to kind of work on all those levels. In fact, at this point, there are limits to what we can do to raise the floor and create opportunity if the imbalance of wealth and power continue as they are. And so it requires us really to move into the more complicated, contested discussions around taxation and the need to tax the wealthy. And this week I was actually at a national conference called Taxing the Wealthy, convened by the Patriotic Millionaires. So it's convened by 250 very wealthy individuals who were basically publicly coming out and saying, we need to fix the tax code. People like us should pay considerably higher taxes. And I want to invite you all to come June 25th. We're having a follow-up conference called Taxing the Very Wealthy in Washington, D.C. And if you sign up for our newsletter, you'll learn about that. And that'll be a national conference, but it's really an important time to engage that conversation around taxation. I think we're in an incredible moment though, because here's what's interesting. There's an undercurrent of understanding that these inequalities are a dead end, that we don't, and the policies that would actually reduce inequality are wildly popular. 75 to 80% of the people polled believe that wealthy people should pay higher taxes, that they should pay the same rates that they did under the socialist presidency of Dwight Eisenhower. Actually, that's my one and only Bernie Sanders imitation. Under the socialist presidency of Dwight Eisenhower, the wealthiest 1% paid 3 times as much income tax, twice as much inheritance tax, invested in public investments in infrastructure, debt-free college, and home ownership for first-time homeowners. Right here. So that what we need are what I call game-changing campaigns. And this is the good news is these are happening all around the country, and you're part of them. And I just want to lift up some of them. And when I say game-changing, because they, one, address this concentration of wealth and power. 2, they often generate resources that can be invested in creating real, meaningful change for low-income people and those who are excluded from opportunity. 3, they come with a constituency that's willing to fight for it and defend the policy. And 4, they change the story or the narratives that hold inequality in place. To me, that's what a game-changing campaign does. Here's an example. I work with a group of students in California who formed a campaign called the California College for All. They're out there fighting to restore California's status as a leader in public higher education. And their proposal is to tax inherited wealth of multimillionaires and billionaires in California, people with more than $10 million of wealth, an inheritance tax, a transfer tax, a state tax, and dedicate that to public higher education in the community college and public state university system. What do they have? They have a constituency, 2.2 million students and their parents who have a stake in that happening. It's a wildly popular idea. How are they changing the story? One of the students said to me, when I stand up and say, I want to have access to education without going into debt for 20 years, people say, oh, you just want a free ride, a free lunch. But when we get, and we have several UUs who went to the University of California system, got a free education in the 60s and 70s, stand up next to these students and say, the society made an extraordinary investment in me and made it possible, and I graduated without debt. And that made a huge made an opportunity for me. And they should have the same opportunity that I did. We've changed the story from one of an entitlement to this is what good societies do. Another example of a game-changing campaign. All over, particularly the East Coast and the West Coast, global wealth is funneling into the United States, looking to park itself Some of that goes into the stock market, but a huge amount of it goes into real estate. And so now all of our communities are being disrupted by global wealth. There's wealth from the United States, but there's global wealth. In Boston, where I live, New York, up and down the East Coast, now the West Coast, there are giant luxury housing developments being built. I call them wealth storage units. You know, like the Storage USA, where regular folks, if they don't have enough room in their garage, get a storage unit. This is wealth storage. It's a new asset class, but it's pushing up the cost of housing for everyone else. Well, what do we do with that? So all these cities are now putting in place luxury real estate transfer taxes. The Boston City Council, 11 of the 13 city councilors just introduced this bill this month to levy a transfer tax on wealth over $2.5 million. Transfers of luxury condominiums or houses over a certain threshold that will go toward creating and preserving permanently affordable housing. San Francisco did it. It generated $44 million last year. New York is trying to do it, but it's a really great example of like, this wealth is mostly hidden. It's mostly held by shell corporations. It's coming in, buying up the land and housing and real estate in our communities in exchange for the opportunity to protect that wealth through our wealth storage unit system, through our local taxpayer-funded services. We would like to tax a portion of that to offset the disruption caused by that. And I think we're going to see lots of cities moving together in tandem. I was with my Mass UU Action folks on Tuesday because we had a big lobby day to institute a millionaire tax in Massachusetts, a 4% tax on incomes over $1 million that will be dedicated to education and public transportation infrastructure. And we're going to win this. We're going to win it. There's no question. It's wildly popular. In fact, we had it was going to the ballot. We collected 156,000 signatures, and they knocked it off the ballot on a technicality. So we are back and we're mad. We're going to win it this time around. Those are just examples. The Green New Deal idea, taxing carbon, investing in green infrastructure, creating good jobs. All those are game-changing campaigns. Nothing may happen hopeful and good in the short term at the federal level, but in fact, all these movements are incubating, educating, and inviting people to be part of making the changes that will unfold. There is a realignment happening. There is a bubbling up of people, not just young. There is a younger people movement, and I think sometimes our UU groups we get a bit like, where are the youth? Where are the young people? But actually, let me tell you, older people are a powerful political force right now. Yes, we have the Sunrise Movement and all these young people, and we want to support them. We want to support the students as they take on their fight by student debt. But it's actually, sometimes it's the retired folks who have the time, the social capital, the ability, the capacity to do what you're doing, which is to show up and be allies and make a difference. So some days you may say like, well, where are the young people? But I have to tell you, I see young people and older people as the leaders, the energy of this transformative social movement right now. One thing that I'm always struck by when I talk about these issues of inequality is, and you've probably had this experience, you talk to somebody and you might even mention some of the statistics I've mentioned, and then they say, well, but don't some of those wealthy people deserve the wealth that they have? I mean, aren't they, did they work for that? And, aren't there some problems and pathologies among low-income people? And you get into this like, oh, it doesn't really matter what data you present. If people have a powerful story in their head of what I would call the story of deservedness, then it's very hard to shift that. And actually, we can propose all the public policies, we can make the arguments, we can marshal the statistics, but if somebody has a story that's basically, here's how I would describe it in a bumper sticker, people are where they deserve to be. If you have a lot of wealth, you deserve to be there by virtue of some reason, virtue on your hard work. J. Paul Getty was once asked, how do you become wealthy in America? The oil billionaire. He said, it's quite simple. There's 3 things you have to do, J. Paul Getty said, and we can do a poll here. 1, get up early every morning. Who got up early? Even on a Saturday, come into a workshop. 2, work hard all day. 3, find oil. Nope, sorry. So, what do we do about the fact that a large percentage of people around us will hear this information about inequality and go, some people get up early. Some people work hard all day. They work harder, smarter, and there's other people who don't. They've essentially taken a simplistic personal narrative, and there's always people have stories in their head. There's Uncle Kate, there's Aunt Kate who's the go-getter, and there's Uncle Richard who's kind of the slacker who comes to the family potluck empty-handed every year, and then and you take these differences and you project them on these systemic inequalities. How do you change those stories? In Born on Third Base, I write a lot about stories of very wealthy people who tell their own success story through the lens of how the web of society, public investments, and family help made their own wealth possible. They are actually disrupting the narratives that hold inequality in place by naming all the ways advantage works and the help that they got, including that, access to education and other things. And that those stories are powerful. But it doesn't just have to be, the sort of Warren Buffetts of the world who tell their personal narrative story through the lens of how do they get help. We can do that. This is actually something that everyone in this room can do, that we can all do, that I think will help, which is there's something in our culture where we can't talk about the help that we got. We all want to be self-made. We all want to be I did it alone. That's our culture. That's the stories that get lifted up. But what's really interesting and powerful, no matter where you started, and I'm sure there are people in this room who literally were raised, and I was born on Third Base. My wife would say she was born in the dugout. She was just trying to get out of the field. But there are ways that we can tell stories of how family help or public assistance have made a difference. The other day, one of these patriotic millionaires was telling his story about how he got help. He went to a land-grant college, University of Illinois, got a free education, went on to design the software system that the Mars lunar rover used. He said, at one point I was on food stamps, boom, my ear perked up. I said, geez, Jerry, we're in a fight for our lives over the food stamp program. Would you like to write a little op-ed about how food stamps made a difference in your life before you became a multi-billionaire entrepreneur? Because that would sort of help this conversation. I was meeting with a group of retired veterans in a suburban town outside Boston. 150 World War II and Korean War veterans, all European heritage. And I said, I'm just curious, how many of you got a debt-free college education after World War II? 3/4 of the men in the room raised their hand. I said, how many of you got a low-interest loan, a 1% mortgage, VA, farmer's home? 3/4 of the men in the room raised their hand. I said, did any of you think that was a waste of taxpayer money? They all laughed. No, that was great. It was the magic carpet to the middle class. I said, well, let's understand, did your children, are any of you helping your children and grandchildren make it in today's economy? And they all raised their hand. They laughed, yeah. One guy says, yeah, I'm the grandpa ATM machine. Another guy says, I'm the parental down payment assistance program. I help the next generation buy houses. Well, those are really important stories to tell. Demystify how opportunity and advantage works. Because if we continue to perpetuate this idea hey, I did it alone, I didn't get any help, and what's the matter with you? We have a president who got, $413 billion in help, and he still thinks he's self-made. Brett Kavanaugh says, I busted my tail to get into Yale.
But my grandfather, I'm a legacy admission, right? How powerful it is when people, without shame or complexity, just said, oh yeah, I got help. My father, who bought a farm in Ohio, outside Lime, Ohio, with a Farmers Home Administration loan, 1% fixed rate, 35-year loan. His monthly payments were $90 a month to buy a huge farm. It made a huge difference. It made a difference for his grandchildren. It made a difference for the entire trajectory of his family. And yet, people don't tell those stories and therefore perpetuate this myth. And if you don't talk about white advantage, how some of these programs enabled white people to propel and left people of color at the station who were barred from those same wealth building programs, if we don't expose that narrative. So that's part of our work, is to think about our own narrative. Not only what it is that you did to be able to have a decent life, but what were the forms of help, and demystify and leave behind the sort of I did it alone narrative, because that's going to be how we move another big boulder out of the way in the conversation about inequality. Let me just close with a thought coming from my background of working with, I work with labor unions, but I've also had these opportunities to work with the very, very wealthy. And I guess the one thing I want you to know is there are obviously people in the 1% who use their wealth and power to rig the rules to get more wealth and power, and they do it quite effectively. There's the whole Koch network. But there's also a huge segment of people who understand that these inequalities actually are bad for the future and the present, and are trying to find ways to be engaged. And then there's an even larger group of advantaged people who are waiting to be invited to something more meaningful than consumption. And part of what I ask everybody to do is, there are unreachable wealthy people. They're just not going to be reached. The walls are too high, the disconnect is too great, the handlers and protectors are too numerous. But don't give up. Think of some of these folks as your long-lost cousins who are coming back, who want to be included in the family reunion but don't know anybody there. There are wealthy people who understand the hollowness and bankruptcy of the culture and the inequalities, and frankly are like my friend, one of the people I interviewed for Born on Third Base, said she felt like she was outside the ice cream parlor looking through a glass window at the kids at the party, wishing she could figure out how to get in the room. And my message to those folks who I've had the opportunity over a couple years to talk to is, it's time to come home. Wealthy people, come home. Bring your full stake back to a community and a place. Bring your wealth home. Take it out of the offshore tax havens and the global financial casino, and bring the wealth back to place, and invest in the real economy of the new food systems and new economy and locally owned enterprises and affordable housing in your community. Bring the wealth home. Pay your fair share of taxes. Stop hiring lawyers and planners to hide your money. Pay your own fair share of taxes. It's great that you're giving to philanthropy. Best if you give it to the UU Faith in Action Network. Give it to the groups that are changing the policies. But philanthropy is not a substitute for an adequately funded public sector and a fair tax system. And so, thank you for your philanthropy, but we need justice. We need justice. come home to the human condition. Come home. That's my invitation. And actually, people are hearing that. There's this whole younger generation called resource generation. That is the theme, come home. And so for those of you who are not in that group, part of your job is to invite people home. Because advantage and privilege is a disconnection drug. It separates people. White advantage separates you. Wealth and class advantage separate us. It separated me for the first 20 years of my life because I was like, I don't have to ask my friend Bill to help me fix my car. I can pay somebody. I don't have to enter into a relationship of reciprocity and vulnerability. I'm outside of that. So if privilege is a disconnection drug, the antidote is connection. And to the extent you might be one of those people who can connect and invite somebody home to that journey. So let me stop there and just to say, it's not too late. We can change these stories that hold extreme inequality in place, and we can crack open the hearts that will be an essential part of our work to change. So, thank you for that. And yes, we are. And while we're doing that, I'm just going to pass around a little clipboard if anybody's interested in inequality.org, or here's a little sheet about our work.
So we have a microphone going around if you have questions.
How do you respond to somebody who gets the type of help we talked about before, such as food stamps, but says those things are just a redistribution of income? They didn't earn those things.
A redistribution of their income, or
a redistribution of income to our economic system, because the people didn't earn things. I'm talking like how a critic would say this. Didn't earn things like food stamps or free college tuition.
Well, I mean, one way to just understand is that's what good societies do, is they help people when they fall through the cracks, when they go down. And I think about like the Nordic countries in Denmark. What's interesting there is they're pro-work societies. They're sort of helping people, get access to education tools. There's a big debate about food stamps, and to me, it's a really interesting how they always are focusing on able-bodied people who aren't working. And that, by the way, is a group that is just shrinking down to 900,000 people. But this is what they justify changing or cutting food stamps around. And it just defies the data, which is people don't want to be on food stamps, but if they are hungry, it's actually a good thing. So good societies redistribute opportunity. And that's where it's like we stigmatize help when it's poor people, and we normalize it when it's middle class and upper income people. And so that's where it's important for if anybody was ever on food stamps to just be public about it. If you got help going to college and you didn't have to graduate with debt, whether it was your family helped you, or you went to a public university system, or you got a scholarship, tell those stories, because otherwise it's always like there are these people over here and they're redistributing. How did we build a white middle class after World War II in this society? We did what Bernie Sanders said. We taxed high incomes and wealth. We invested it in public goods and social mobility and opportunity. Find some people who got those benefits who thought they were a bad idea. That was redistributional. That was, part of why when I've been involved in these fights around defending the estate tax, defending the inheritance tax, and people attack it, and we found all these people who stand up and say, I'll pay the estate tax. Makes good sense. I want to live in a society where we reinvest in the next generation. If you're fortunate enough to have the amount of wealth that you will have to pay in estate tax, it's an economic opportunity recycling program. Redistribution is a bad word, but we do redistribute wealth in this country upward through public policies. So let's just redistribute it in a way that helps those who've been left behind. That's one response.
I think another factor is
Let's get a couple of people in the conversation in addition.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, something happened in your life when you were 20 years old or something. Can you just give, there's a breakthrough moment. Can you give us just a brief, okay?
Yeah, I would say it was, I was 7 when the Detroit riots happened. I had a mother who, said, this is in some ways, what's happening is because things are not fair in this society. But I had a lot of experiences, and I think about my UU youth group, we would go and visit working class congregations, part of neighboring faiths. You're like, by the way, no other denomination I know goes out and visits other religious, it's like there's like, why are you here? You're the competition, we're just here to learn what you're doing. And, I led the neighboring faiths group for my kids, and we would go to these Hindu temples, and they were like, nobody ever comes to visit us. You're the only people who come to visit us and ask us what we're doing. Don't underestimate the power of taking people out of their context. But one thing that did happen to me, and I write about this in Born on Third Base, is I had this job working with mobile home park tenants who were trying to buy their parks and own them as cooperatives. And so I was the guy who did all the underwriting, and so I interviewed all these people and got all their private information. And my big takeaway was like, holy mackerel, these people have like no money. I mean, I was like, I had more of a front row seat and intimate experience of how people were surviving as wages started to stagnate. But then I also had this contradiction, which was all the people in my family and the community I grew up in were like, yeah, we bought that house for X and we just sold it for 20X, or we're invested in the XYZ fund and it has a 26% return. So I was also seeing like wealth multiplying. So I had that like front row seat to how inequalities were opening up. And for some reason, the mythology of deservedness, it's so clear, like being born on third base, I didn't do anything. I just picked my parents. I didn't even do that, So I think that there were, and then I worked in El Salvador too I was a nice UU working with Catholic Relief Services. So that, again, I got more of a global picture. And at a certain point, whatever narrative you were fed just doesn't work anymore. You can't come up with an explanation for the gap between my good fortune and these other people I were meeting. And then, you either shut down and become numb, or fortunately I was around, I could keep a little bit of attention up and my heart open a little bit that I could move forward. So, and I think I would say there is a heart-cracking open moment for many people where I don't have the time to tell you the story, but the stories of people who basically go into a situation just like that, where it's like, that story that justified poverty that I was told, it doesn't work anymore because there's this person here. And again, that's where being in relationship and connection, and to the extent all of our work is about widening that circle of love and connection and the interconnectedness of our people and community, the harder it is to swallow the bullshit about why some people have so much and why some people have so little.
Anybody completely with this concept of the interconnectedness and all the strategies that you described for mitigating the ill effects of capitalism that is what needs to be done immediately. But my question is, and I just want to make an observation about capitalism, just so we're cognitively coordinated here. I see the prevailing interpretation and implementation is the mandate to concentrate as much wealth as possible into the hands of as few as possible, regardless of moral, ethical, legal, biophysical, or geophysical consideration. And these strategies that you describe are going to address that moral, ethical, legal, biophysical, and geophysical consideration. But the foundation of this paradigm, which is the mandate to concentrate as much wealth as possible into the hands of as few as possible, is going to remain. And as we know, in the 30s, we tried to harness capitalism, and it worked for 50 to 60 years, and then it broke free of the harnesses, and now we've got the situation we have. So my question is there a paradigm which will recognize the references that you have made about the interconnectedness of all life, which will not work within the capitalist paradigm, which even if we all get together now, 30 years later, there's a new generation who will have forgotten about what this is for. Is there a new paradigm that you can see, keeping in mind that any new paradigm is going to appear to be science fiction?
I think I got it. So one, I think, of the challenges, we have these kind of cartoon caricature words, socialism, whatever that means, right, in this current political conversation. Capitalism, what does that mean? And one way I find when talking to people is, well, look, there's a lot of different flavors of capitalism. We are living in this particular kind of hyper-extractive, hyper-individualistic capitalism that commodifies nature. But there are other ways to wire the system. So what happens, so what should the next system look like? And maybe the way I find it is you just describe what the characteristics are, what the next system needs to look like. It needs to operate within the ecological constraints, right? So we're not going to reduce inequality in the same playbook that we did after World War II, which was economic growth based on extracting huge amounts of fossil fuel, burning it, dumping. That playbook is done. So whatever system we're going to live by, it's going to have to operate within the boundaries of. So that's going to largely inform what's possible. We also don't want to have extreme inequalities. We can learn from, the Danish system or the Swedish system where they have this really high floor, and they also put limits on how concentrated wealth can become. And even the wealthy in those societies understand that they benefit from a society with less inequality. So I think that there are ways, without kind of having to get into the semantics of what is it we want? What are the characteristics? How do we rewire an economy to not have those kind of levels of inequality? And we don't even have a word for that. I would just say it's some sort of, it could be democratic capitalism, democratic socialism. It doesn't look like the capitalism that we have now. So I think we're a little bit stuck in that discussion, and I think the most useful way forward is to say here's the characteristics of the next system, and people hugely support those basic principles as we move forward.
We've got time for one more question from Claire.
So I just want to say that I came from a family that went bankrupt, moved to California, and I had free education and I got a PhD. So it's thank you, California, for providing that. I'm one of those people. My question is, given all of the sort of strategies that you've outlined as to how things could change, I won't ask you which presidential candidate you're supporting, but which one has the most or the best of those strategies in their playbook?
Yeah. Well, first I should say it's great that we're going to have this wild, multiple voices, multiple candidates process. That's exactly what I think our society needs, and we need to be I do think that these issues of inequality are very much going to be at the center of it. I think from the policy wonk perspective, Elizabeth Warren has put out the most interesting, she has this proposal that hasn't gotten a lot of publicity for rewiring corporate governance and creating a federal charter on global corporations. I think her proposal on a wealth tax is exactly the direction we need to go. We need to understand, there's this concentrated wealth, and we don't have an annual wealth tax. Senator Sanders has this proposal for a progressive estate tax, which would also sort of slow that intergenerational transfer of power and wealth. And I think we're going to see people competing to come up with other bold ideas. Senator Booker's proposal around baby bonds and this idea right now, the wealthiest fifth of the society is helping their kids get huge advantages in the society. That's what parents do. We help our kids. How do you offset that? You provide, an intergenerational wealth transfer for people who don't have family wealth. And that's this baby bond idea. So I think it's an exciting, robust time, and we want to basically say, let's hear all the great ideas to address inequality and eliminate the people who are just kind of here's one lens to look at. Do they talk about the concentration of wealth and power? Because it's actually easy to talk about things that raise the floor. And it's easy to talk about things that create opportunity for all. But the taboo that is not, the cultural taboo, the silence is still around the relationship between the updraft of concentrated wealth and power and how that's affecting everyone else. And I'm looking for candidates who will talk about it all, but not leave out the destructive power of concentrated wealth and power in the society right now. Will they speak to that? Or will they just leave that out of their speech because they don't want to offend wealth and power? That's to me the lens I would bring to the conversation. So.
Thank you.
Anyway, thank you all.